G'day guys, it's Adam here, the Australian Aquarist. Thanks for coming back and being part of my build of my 4,000 litre, 12 foot long, 1.2 metres wide or 4 foot wide and 1 metre or 3.5 foot high plywood reef paludarium that is such a mouthful that is crazy. For monster. I couldn't quite help myself in the last video and I had to go and install the framing for the back wall of the tank. But in doing so, and getting one step ahead of myself, I made a mistake. So I would normally sheet the bottom of the tank first. I would normally build this subfloor. I then would screw and epoxy the plywood down to it. I would then construct the framing for the rear wall. I would drop that down on top of the floor, screw it down through the plywood floor, and then sheet the rear wall. But as I've already mentioned, well, I'm impatient, I couldn't help myself. So, well, we make do. I realized I had no back plate to pick up that free edge of the plywood. It was only going to rest on each of these joists. I had some scrap timber lying around and I've just put these short blocks in all the way along to pick up the free edge of that plywood and make sure it's got a good seating all the way along the back. I've actually doubled up on this last joist and I've done exactly the same down that end of the tank. You might be wondering, well, why have I done that? Short return or a short nib wall. That was a terrible description. I simply needed more timber underneath to make sure I could screw that little nib wall down and make this back wall square to the bottom frame of the tank. Done. I'd like to say a big thank you to Bote-Cote Pacific up there in Brisbane, Queensland, Australia. Thanks very much, guys. A little while ago, I reached out to Bote-Cote Pacific and I went and met with them in person. I tormented them with all my colourful drawings and plans of this 4,000 litre plywood paludarium, and they agreed to come on board as sponsors of this build. This is the pack that Bote-Cote Pacific has sent me down. So just to go through quickly, this is the Bote-Cote Epoxy and hardener. It's a 2-to-1 epoxy, unlike other epoxies which are a 5-to-1, which can actually make the measuring and the accuracy of that process a lot easier, because very small mistakes with a 5-to-1 epoxy can mean big impacts when the time comes to cure the epoxy. Also supplied me with the filler powder. Now this is the filler powder that is used to thicken the epoxy to form a glue, or to thicken the epoxy even more to form the fillets that are used to strengthen the joins before fiberglassing. Speaking of fiberglassing, I've got some fiberglass to run down all the internal joins. I've got a range of different pigments, green, black, white, blue, to tint the epoxy. I've also got my Aquacoat, which is a polyurethane top coat system, and that'll be the final, really quite hard wearing coating in my aquarium. A lot more resistant to things like grazing sea urchins, and also provide the coloration that I want, and the final layer of waterproofing. I've got some sandpaper, a range of foam rollers and brushes, and what else have I got? Some cross-linker, which is to be used with the polyurethane top coating system. If you do have any questions along the way in regards to the Bote-Cote Pacific products, just shoot them down in the comments and I'd be very, very happy to help you out, get the answer. And if I don't know the answer, I'm going to refer straight to the manufacturers up in Brizzy and we'll get you the answer that you need. Thank you very much, Bote-Cote Pacific. Let's get busy.
I never really know what's going on. Look at me sometimes like all you want to do is run. Hear me out, hear me out.
This plywood is 17mm construction pine plywood. In Australia, we have two major choices. We have what they call marine plywood and we have construction pine plywood. And for a long time I thought that marine plywood was the absolute way to go. And now I'm actually starting to think that the choice of plywood is less of a factor than what I first thought. So marine plywood is not based on the fact that it's a hardwood, it's based on the glues that are actually used in the manufacturing process. As long as the plywood is completely sealed, and I'm going to be using 3 coats of epoxy and 2 coats of polyurethane, then I don't actually think it particularly matters what type of timber is utilised underneath that waterproofing. If you think about it, if there's a breach in the waterproofing and somehow water penetrates through that polyurethane, penetrates through the epoxy and gets into the plywood, regardless if the plywood is a hardwood, marine plywood, or a softwood pine construction, it's going to rot. It's going to rot. The main focus of this build is to prevent that happening, not to stress so much on the nature of the plywood itself. There's a few knots there, there's a few little voids. So this is going to be the underside. Make sure you do your epoxying somewhere where it's not going to matter too much if you get drips on the ground. It's going to happen. I've set up the plywood on buckets, and you notice that I've actually got the overhang past the actual bucket. If you actually sit your plywood directly onto a table or a bench or the ground, you will glue it to that surface. And we're going to give this plywood a bit of a sand down. We're going to round down a bit of the edges. We're going to blow the whole lot off with the blower to get rid of any dust. And then we're going to start mixing up some Bote-Cote. The main reason why you want to actually sand the plywood first before you put the epoxy down is not so much to make it smooth. It's to remove any of the dirt and dust that comes from the hardware store, any marks, any contaminants that might be on the surface. It's very, very hard not to want to run your hands over it at the end also, but obviously we've got greases and oils on our bodies, and I don't want to put that back onto the timber after just sanding it off. You may have also noticed that I haven't done any cutting of the plywood. I highly recommend that you get your hardware store to actually cut the plywood for you first. You're going to save yourself a lot of trouble. When you're measuring your epoxy out, it's really important that you get the ratios quite accurate. And I really like to use this style of mixing jug because it actually, if you look very closely there, it's actually got these numbers around the top there. They're ratios from 10 to 1, 12 to 1, all the way down to 2 to 1. And what it does, it actually allows you to accurately measure the different parts of the epoxy, the 2 parts, according to the mixing ratio that's required. So for Bote-Cote here, Bote-Cote is a 2 to 1 epoxy to hardener system. I'll select the 2 to 1 guide on this side of the actual container. So you'll put in the part A to the part A line in the jug, and then you'll top that jug up to the part B. And that way you've got the correct ratio of the A to B epoxy. I hope that makes sense. It's a very long-winded way of saying it. You're making sure that you actually scrape the epoxy and the hardener away from the walls and away from the base. Now for very small volumes of epoxy, less than sort of 100 mils, you're going to have to let the epoxy sit in the container on the bench for about 10 minutes, just to sort of heat up a little bit and start to expel some of the air bubbles. A volume like this, you won't have to wait quite so long, but it is normal for air bubbles to start to rise in the mixed epoxy. And once that starts to rise out of the epoxy, it's actually pretty good to start using.
Is this really happening? I can't believe it's true. I'm just as surprised as you. Is this really happening? I can't be too sure, but one day I'll be yours again.
I'm going to use a wet on wet method or a wet on tacky method. So that's where I actually apply the first coat, and I'll let it cure for, well, it's going to vary depending upon the temperature of the day, but I'm going to let it cure until it goes tacky. And then I'm going to apply the second coat. Being a wet on wet method, that second coat's going to bond nicely with the first coat. The other way of applying the epoxy is to apply the first coat, let it cure fully, and you have to sand it back to actually allow the second coat that you apply to key in properly with the first coat. The other reason for sanding back that first coat is to remove any contaminants that may have landed on it in the meantime during the curing process.
Is this really happening? I can't be too sure, but one day I'll be yours again.
Bote-Cote is designed to be used in Australian conditions, but Australian conditions can vary a fair bit, and there is a variety of different hardeners which are available, which you can select from their website or from your local retailer based on where you live. So there's just the standard everyday hardener, which is what I've got here for your more sort of temperate environments. There's also a tropical hardener, and that actually just slows down the hardening or the curing process. And there's also a fast curing hardener if you live in a cold environment or you're going to do it in, I guess, the middle of winter. Righto, so Bote-Cote Epoxy needs 24 hours to cure. But before we bring it inside and actually fix it to the framing of the aquarium, I want to take it outside and knock off those dags that have run around to the underside, which is actually the top side, and cured. The best tool to do that, in my experience, is a grinder with a flat disc. Make sure you do it outside. It's very dusty. Wear a face mask. You can also heat it up and scrape it off with the chisel, but I find it's much faster just to tear into it with a grinder. The other thing that I'm going to do before I actually put the sheeting down, the plywood sheeting down onto this subfloor, is I'm actually going to mark the positions, the centers of the joists on this back plate. And that's so that when I actually want to pre-drill, countersink, and then screw the sheeting down to these joists, I know exactly the position of the joist. I can flick a line and pre-drill without actually missing. You're going to mark some guidelines, which is about 15 mil in from the edge of the front plate and the two end plates. And they used to basically give me a guideline that I'm going to fix this plywood in the right position. You may notice just in this corner here that the actual frame itself, the subfloor, is not square. The plywood's square. I know it's square because I had it cut down at the actual hardware store for me. Fix this back corner, fix that back corner, and use some clamps or some straps to try and just pull this frame back across to square it up for me before I fix the plywood to it. So in regards to screwing the actual plywood to the frame, especially in regards to the base of the tank, the screws, well, they're not 100% necessary. Obviously they're ideal to actually locate the plywood in the first instance, but as far as doing the grid like I've done here with the countersinking bit, the screwing in that position, you could take it or leave it. You could glue the actual plywood down, but in actual fact, the weight of the water is going to certainly hold that and press that sheet down, but it does feel nice. It does feel nice to screw it down. I'm not, however, going to pop the screws into each of these countersunk holes because that is actually a breach of the waterproofing. If I was to screw down through that hole now and fasten this plywood to the subfloor, there is unsealed plywood in contact with that screw, and that screw is going from the top all the way through to the bottom. So what I'm going to do to start off with is I'm actually going to vacuum all of this sawdust up, and then before screwing, I'm going to get a little syringe, I'm going to make up some Bote-Cote Epoxy, and I'm going to squirt some epoxy into each of these holes and then fix the screw in place. Righto, so I may as well make up a big batch of epoxy because after I've filled each of the screw holes with epoxy, and I did manage to track down a bit of an old syringe just for that purpose, I need to do 2 coats of Bote-Cote to do the preliminary sealing of this plywood. A little trick for you is to let the stick or the mixing stick go off in the actual container, give it a bit of a crack, a gentle crack, don't break the container, and the actual original stick should come out with a bit of epoxy attached to the base of it. Sometimes the entire residue comes out cured on that stick. In this case here, there's the remaining epoxy. We can chuck that away, reuse the stick, and you've got a clean container to mix another batch of epoxy up. It's summertime here in Australia and it's a little bit warm this evening. See here how far I got, and the simple reason with that is the epoxy, as it got warmer and warmer, waiting for me in that mixing container, it starts to thicken. And as it starts to thicken, it becomes a lot harder to actually spread it. And I don't want to overwork this epoxy now, so I know I haven't actually finished screening it all the way to the full extent of the floor, but if I overwork it, it's going to clump up and it's not going to spread properly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this, I'll let it go tacky, I'll come back and do another coat, and then I'll let that go tacky, and I'll do a third or a 2.5 coat, whatever you want to call it. So 2 more coats of epoxy onto the tank. Why is it black? The actual top coat system I'm going to use, which is the Aqua-Coat polyurethane, is tinted, and that colour building process works a lot better if the base coat, which in this case is the epoxying layers, has some colour depth to it already. So I put some black and some white into it. You might be able to see, well, you can't see, hang on a second, and I'll make you see. So you can see that how shiny the epoxy is, but you can also see these annoying little bugs. What's even worse, when the little bugs want to fall into the epoxy and then go round and round and round and round and make a giant big mess. So what do I have to do now? Well, I do have to sand the epoxy anyhow, and that's because I do need to do a third coat of epoxy, but in the process of sanding, I'm going to be able to remove all the bugs. Right, enough of that. Let's have a little break. Come check this out. This is the actual size of the tank that I'm building. For you guys who haven't seen my channel before, this is the 12 foot by 4 foot front to back and 3.5 foot high turtle and rainbow fish aquarium. Going to leave it like this for the time being, which brings me to those plywood sheets. These plywood sheets are the back wall of the tank, and they need 2 coats of epoxy on the inside. I've already done 2 coats on what is the outside surface, but they need 2 coats on the inside surface, and that means what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some colour to it. I've got black pigment and white pigment. It says to use 10 grams of the coloration per 1 litre of epoxy mix. It's actually not a lot. You don't need a lot of this coloration. The reason I'm going to put colour into this Bote-Cote Epoxy is because I want to start building a bit of a base colour on the plywood, so that when the time comes to actually apply the Aqua-Coat polyurethane coating, which is a coloured polyurethane, I want to have a coloured base to it, so it means that I won't have to do as many coats of the polyurethane. I won't have to build the colour up as much at that stage because I've already started. So I've laid these 2 sheets out on the base of the tank. These are actually the plywood sheets that are going to be stood up against the rear wall of the aquarium. They need 1 more coat of epoxy before I can stand them up. So I've just mixed up a really small amount of the epoxy, the Bote-Cote Epoxy, to actually start the base for making up my epoxy glue. I'm just giving it a very good mix. I think I made about 350 mils to go along the base or the back wall of that tank. And what I'm going to use to thicken the epoxy is this product here, which is a fillet or glue filler powder. I'm going to keep adding this fillet powder until the epoxy forms a thickness that I'm comfortable with. I've been told that you really can't go too far with adding the fillet powder. Obviously, if you go too far, there'll be more fillet powder than epoxy, and it's going to go crumbly, and it won't actually be a glue. It'll be breadcrumbs. So we're not going to go that far, but I'll keep adding it just until I find I've got the right consistency, which will be like toothpaste, I guess. And then I'll use a combination of the spoon or a paintbrush just to apply it, and as a bead along the back wall of the base of the tank. And then I can actually leave that. I can come back to applying a coat of epoxy over the plywood, the reverse side of this plywood, and stand it up against the back wall. Thanks very much for following on in this build process. I really do appreciate the support. And speaking of support, I do appreciate the support from Pacific Boatcraft, or Boatcraft Pacific. I get that wrong all the time, don't I? If you are considering building your own plywood aquarium, go and check out their website, which is boatcraft.com.au, and that's where you'll find all the different epoxies like Bote-Cote, the polyurethane like Aqua-Coat, as well as different glues and accessories. So go check those guys out. Thank you very much, Boatcraft Pacific. And thank you very much to you guys. This is Christmas Eve, and I think I should probably leave this task for now and come back maybe on Boxing Day, clean up all these drips and these dags and get it ready for the next stage of the build, which will be figuring out how to build an island. If you are seeing this video for the first time and you're wondering what in the world is this guy doing, go back and check out this video, maybe even this video, and that'll explain exactly what I'm trying to do. While you're there, subscribe to my channel and certainly tick that bell notification because that's going to show you when I put a new video out. Thank you very much and I'll see you next time.